The departure hall of Raven International Airport buzzed with the usual rhythm of hurried footsteps, rolling suitcases, and overhead announcements. Travelers rushed toward their gates, families embraced before long flights, and business executives hurried past with eyes fixed on their phones. It was an ordinary afternoon, until every phone suddenly stopped ringing. A line of black luxury SUVs rolled silently toward the VIP entrance. Airport security officers exchanged uneasy glances through their radios. "They're here." Within seconds, additional guards took their positions. Police officers moved discreetly to the edges of the terminal, while airport staff quietly redirected passengers away from the entrance without explaining why. Everyone knew better than to ask questions. The first SUV door opened. 6 men in perfectly tailored black suits stepped out first. Their movements were synchronized, their expressions unreadable. Hidden earpieces connected them as their eyes swept every corner of the terminal. Each one carried himself with the calm confidence of someone trained to face danger without hesitation. Then the second vehicle opened. A tall man stepped onto the pavement. He looked to be in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit him with effortless elegance. A black overcoat rested over his shoulders despite the warm afternoon. Dark tattoos disappeared beneath the collar of his crisp white shirt, hinting at a dangerous past few people dared mention aloud. This was Alessandro De Luca. To the public, he was an influential international businessman. To those who lived in the shadows, he was one of the most feared Mafia bosses in Europe. Rumors followed him everywhere. Some claimed he could end wars with a single phone call. Others whispered that entire criminal organizations disappeared after refusing his offers. Whether the stories were true hardly mattered. His reputation arrived long before he did. Passengers instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path without being asked. No one wanted to stand in Alessandro's way. His bodyguards surrounded him in a protective diamond formation as he entered the terminal. Every movement was practiced. Every exit had already been mapped. Every stranger was considered a possible threat. Alessandro barely noticed the stares. His face remained calm, almost emotionless. He had attended meetings in far more dangerous places than an airport. As he approached the private security checkpoint, something unexpected happened. A small backpack slipped from a nearby bench. It hit the polished floor with a soft thud. Before anyone could react, a little girl darted after it. She couldn't have been older than 6. Her chestnut curls bounced as she ran. She wore a faded yellow dress beneath a small denim jacket and worn white sneakers that had clearly seen better days. Around her neck hung a tiny silver heart-shaped pendant that seemed oddly precious compared to the rest of her clothes. A woman several yards behind shouted desperately, "Emily! Stop!" But the child didn't stop. She wasn't chasing her backpack anymore. She was staring directly at Alessandro. The bodyguards noticed immediately. Unknown child approaching, one of them spoke quietly into his microphone. 2 guards moved forward. Another reached beneath his jacket. Airport security officers stiffened. Children were unpredictable. And unpredictable situations around powerful men often ended badly. The little girl ignored every warning. She slipped between 2 startled passengers, ducked under the arm of a security officer, and sprinted toward the group of armed bodyguards. "Somebody grab her," an officer shouted. The nearest bodyguard stepped forward to intercept her. Before he could reach her, she unexpectedly changed direction, weaving around him with surprising speed. The crowd gasped. Phones appeared in every direction as people began recording. Another bodyguard reached for her? He missed by inches. Then, in one final burst of determination, the little girl threw herself forward. She wrapped both tiny arms around Alessandro's waist. Everything stopped. The bodyguards froze. Airport security froze. Even Alessandro's footsteps came to an abrupt halt. For several seconds, no one moved. The child clung tightly to him as though she had finally found the only safe place left in the world. Her small shoulders trembled. Then everyone heard her voice. Soft. Broken. Filled with relief. Daddy. The single word echoed louder than the airport announcements. A stunned silence swept across the terminal. Several bodyguards instinctively drew their pistols halfway from their holsters, unsure whether this was some elaborate distraction. Airport officers reached for their radios. One woman covered her mouth in disbelief. Alessandro looked down slowly. His icy expression, feared by countless enemies, cracked for the first time in years. The little girl looked up at him with tear-filled brown eyes. I finally found you, she whispered. Alessandro had never seen the child before. At least, that was what he believed. As she tightened her grip around him, the silver pendant resting against her chest slipped into view. His breathing stopped. His eyes widened ever so slightly. He recognized that pendant. There was only one person in the world who had ever owned it. A woman he had loved. A woman who had disappeared without leaving a single trace 7 years earlier. Before he could say a word, one of his senior bodyguards leaned closer. Boss, he said cautiously, his voice barely above a whisper. Do you know this little girl? Alessandro never answered. He simply stared at the pendant, while questions he had buried for years came rushing back all at once. And for the first time since building his empire, the most feared Mafia boss in Europe found himself shaken by something no bullet had ever accomplished, a frightened little girl calling him Dad. The terminal remained frozen in stunned silence. No one seemed willing to breathe. The little girl still held tightly to Alessandro De Luca's waist, as though letting go might cause him to disappear forever. Her tiny fingers gripped the fabric of his overcoat with surprising strength. Around them, dozens of passengers watched with wide eyes. Some continued filming on their phones, while others whispered among themselves, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. The little girl called him Dad. Is she really his daughter? How is that even possible? Alessandro ignored every voice around him. His attention remained fixed on the silver heart-shaped pendant resting against the child's chest. His mind had traveled years into the past. He remembered the day he had bought it. It had been a warm spring afternoon in Florence, long before he became the ruthless leader everyone feared. Back then, he was simply a man hopelessly in love with a young woman named Isabella Moretti. She had laughed when he handed her the tiny velvet box. You didn't have to buy me anything, she had teased. I wanted something that would always remind you of me, he had replied. She had fastened the pendant around her neck and smiled. Then I'll never take it off. That had been the last promise she ever made to him. Months later, Isabella vanished without warning. No goodbye. No letter. No explanation. Alessandro searched for her across Europe, spending millions and calling in every favor he had. His men searched hospitals, border crossings, hotels, and safe houses. Nothing. It was as though she had disappeared from the face of the earth. Eventually, he convinced himself she had chosen to leave. It was the only explanation that made sense. Until now. The trembling voice of the little girl pulled him back to the present. You really don't remember me, do you? Her words pierced through him. Slowly, Alessandro knelt so they were eye level. For the first time in years, the feared Mafia boss softened his voice. What is your name? The girl sniffled before answering. Emily. Emily. She nodded. My mommy told me I'd know you when I saw you. A flicker of emotion crossed Alessandro's face. What was your mother's name? The little girl smiled sadly. Isabella. The name struck him like a punch to the chest. His bodyguards exchanged uneasy glances. Only a handful of them had ever heard that name before. Alessandro's closest advisor, Marco, stepped forward carefully. Boss! Alessandro raised one hand, stopping him. He couldn't speak. Emily reached into the small backpack hanging from one shoulder. I brought this. She pulled out a faded photograph, its edges worn from years of being handled. With trembling hands, Alessandro accepted it. The picture showed a much younger Isabella standing beside a lake, smiling brightly. In her arms was a newborn baby wrapped in a pale pink blanket. Written across the back in neat handwriting were 5 simple words. For her father, one day. Alessandro stared at the words until they blurred. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. "My mommy kept it." "Where is your mother now?" Emily lowered her head. The bright spark in her eyes disappeared. "She went to heaven." The words were so soft they almost disappeared beneath the airport noise. Alessandro felt something inside him break. When? 3 weeks ago. He closed his eyes. 3 weeks. For 7 years he had believed Isabella had abandoned him. Now he was learning she had spent those years raising a little girl alone. Emily continued speaking. "Before Mommy got really sick, she told me something." Alessandro looked at her. "She said if anything ever happened to her, I had to find the man in this picture." Emily pointed to him. "She said you'd protect me." The crowd around them had grown completely silent. Even the security officers had lowered their radios. One elderly woman quietly wiped tears from her eyes. Marco leaned closer again. "Boss, we should leave. This crowd is getting too large." Alessandro nodded faintly. He stood and extended his hand. Emily looked at it uncertainly. Then she smiled. Her tiny fingers slipped into his large hand without hesitation. It felt strangely natural, as though they had done it 1,000 times before. Alessandro turned toward his security team. "No one questions her." "Yes, boss." "No one frightens her." "Understood." "And no one separates her from me." Every bodyguard nodded immediately. As they began walking toward the private exit, Alessandro noticed several unfamiliar faces watching from the upper level of the terminal. 3 men dressed as ordinary travelers. 2 ordinary. They weren't carrying luggage. They weren't watching departure screens. They were watching Emily. One of them quietly lifted his phone and snapped a picture. Marco noticed it too. "Boss." "I saw." The stranger immediately turned away and disappeared into the crowd. Marco's instincts sharpened. "I don't like this." Neither did Alessandro. Outside, the convoy prepared to depart. The rear door of Alessandro's armored SUV opened. Emily climbed inside beside him. As the vehicles pulled away from the terminal, none of them noticed the black sedan that eased silently into traffic behind them. Inside sat the same 3 men from the airport. The passenger lowered his phone after sending the photograph. A reply arrived almost instantly. "Target confirmed. The child is with De Luca." The driver smiled coldly. "So," he murmured, loading a magazine into his pistol, "after 7 years, we finally found them both." Far ahead, unaware of the danger closing in, Emily leaned her head gently against Alessandro's shoulder. For the first time since losing her mother, she felt safe. But the journey that had reunited father and daughter had also awakened enemies who would stop at nothing to tear them apart once again. The convoy moved swiftly through the rain-soaked streets, its 6 armored SUVs weaving through traffic with military precision. Sirens echoed in the distance as commuters instinctively pulled aside, unaware of the precious cargo hidden inside the center vehicle. Emily sat quietly beside Alessandro De Luca. For the first time since leaving the airport, she looked relaxed. Her small hands rested on the stuffed rabbit she had pulled from her backpack, while her head leaned gently against the leather seat. Alessandro couldn't stop looking at her. Every few seconds, he caught himself studying her face. The shape of her eyes. The curve of her smile. Even the way she tucked a loose curl behind her ear reminded him of Isabella. 7 years. 7 years of believing he had been abandoned. 7 years during which his daughter had grown up without him. His chest tightened. "I'm sorry," he whispered so softly that only he could hear the words. Emily looked up. "What did you say?" He forced a small smile. "Nothing." She reached for his hand. "Mommy used to get sad too." He looked at her in surprise. "When?" "When she talked about you." His heart nearly stopped. Before he could ask another question, Marco's voice crackled through the vehicle's communication system. "Boss." Alessandro pressed the button beside him. "Report. I think we're being followed." Every bodyguard inside the convoy immediately became alert. Alessandro glanced through the tinted rear window. 3 black SUVs. Exactly the same distance behind them. Matching every turn. Matching every lane change. His instincts sharpened instantly. "How long?" "Since we left the airport." Alessandro's jaw tightened. So they finally made their move. Marco's voice remained calm. "Orders?" "Don't panic the child." "Understood." Alessandro gently squeezed Emily's hand. "Would you like to play a little game?" She smiled. "I like games. We're going to pretend we're secret agents." Her eyes sparkled. "Really?" He nodded. "You stay very quiet no matter what happens." She grinned. "I can do that." Before another word could be spoken. Boom! A deafening explosion erupted behind them. The last SUV in the convoy lifted partially off the ground as flames burst beneath it. Passengers on nearby roads screamed. Cars swerved wildly. Marco's voice thundered through the radio. "Ambush!" Gunfire exploded from both sides of the highway. Bullets hammered against the armored vehicles like heavy rain. Alessandro reacted instantly. He unbuckled his seatbelt and pulled Emily onto the floor of the SUV, covering her completely with his own body. "It's okay," he said calmly. "I've got you." Emily trembled beneath him. Outside, chaos erupted. Bodyguards leaned from reinforced windows, returning controlled bursts of fire toward masked attackers racing alongside them in black vehicles. One attacker stood through the sunroof carrying an assault rifle. Glass shattered. Tires screeched. The convoy accelerated. Marco's SUV suddenly slammed sideways into one of the attackers. Metal crunched violently. The enemy vehicle spun across 3 lanes before crashing into the concrete barrier in a shower of sparks. Another black SUV appeared ahead, blocking the highway. "They're trying to trap us," a bodyguard shouted. Alessandro's driver never slowed. "Hold on." The armored vehicle smashed through the blockade with tremendous force, sending the smaller SUV spinning into the guardrail. Emily buried her face against Alessandro's chest. He shielded her head with both arms as the impact rocked the vehicle. "You promised we'd be okay," she whispered. "We will be." His voice never shook. "I promise." Minutes later, the surviving convoy finally escaped onto a private industrial road leading toward one of Alessandro's secure estates. The shooting stopped. Silence slowly returned. Inside the SUV, Alessandro carefully examined Emily. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "No." He let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Marco's voice returned. "We lost one vehicle." Alessandro closed his eyes briefly. "Casualties?" 2 men injured. "No fatalities." "Good." Marco hesitated. "Boss." "They weren't trying to kill you." Alessandro already knew. They were after her. His eyes drifted toward Emily. Someone knew the truth. Someone had discovered she existed. And someone wanted her before Alessandro could learn why. An hour later, the convoy arrived at Villa De Luca, a heavily fortified estate hidden behind towering stone walls and surrounded by dense forest. Security gates closed immediately behind them. Armed guards doubled their patrols. No one entered without Alessandro's permission. Emily looked around in amazement. This place is huge. Alessandro smiled faintly. You'll be safe here. After making sure she had something warm to eat, he walked into his private office with Marco. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, Marco broke the silence. We can't keep guessing anymore. Alessandro nodded. I know. Marco placed a business card on the desk. The country's best forensic geneticist is already waiting downstairs. Alessandro looked toward the closed office door. If Emily is truly my daughter. Marco finished the sentence quietly. Then everything changes. Alessandro stared at the family photograph lying on his desk. He remembered Isabella's smile. He remembered the promise they had made to build a future together. Perhaps that future had never truly disappeared. Perhaps it had simply been stolen. Downstairs, Emily laughed softly as one of the housekeepers handed her a cup of hot chocolate. The innocent sound echoed through the mansion. Alessandro closed his eyes. He silently prayed for only one thing: that the DNA test would finally reveal the truth. Because if Emily really was his daughter, then the people responsible for stealing 7 years from them had just declared war on the most dangerous man they would ever meet. Morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Villa De Luca, but the atmosphere inside the mansion was anything but peaceful. The attack on the highway had changed everything. Armed guards patrolled every hallway. Surveillance operators monitored dozens of screens in the security room, while additional patrol vehicles circled the estate's perimeter. No one entered. No one left. Inside his private office, Alessandro De Luca stood silently before the fireplace. He hadn't slept. Every few minutes his eyes drifted toward the folder lying on his desk. Inside were the DNA test results. The sealed envelope felt heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. "It's ready, boss," Marco said quietly. Alessandro nodded. "Come in." Marco entered with Dr. Elena Rossi, the forensic geneticist who had worked through the night. She placed another copy of the report on the desk. "I've verified the results 3 separate times." Alessandro looked at her. "No mistakes." "None." The doctor took a slow breath. "The probability of biological paternity is 99.999%. Silence filled the room. Emily was his daughter. There was no longer any doubt. Alessandro slowly lowered himself into his chair. For years, he had accepted the lie that Isabella had abandoned him. Instead, she had protected their child alone until her final breath. A single tear escaped before he quickly wiped it away. Marco pretended not to notice. The feared Mafia boss rarely showed emotion. Today was different. Dr. Rossi quietly excused herself, leaving the 2 men alone. Marco finally spoke. "What now?" Alessandro stared at the report. "Now we discover who stole 7 years from my daughter." Just then, a timid knock came from the office door. Emily peeked inside. "Can I come in?" Alessandro's expression softened immediately. "Of course." She walked over holding her stuffed rabbit. "Are you sad?" He opened his arms. Without hesitation, she climbed onto his lap. He hugged her carefully, afraid she might disappear if he held her too tightly. "You remind me so much of your mother." Emily smiled. "Mommy said you smiled with your eyes." Alessandro couldn't help but laugh quietly. She remembered that. Emily nodded. "She talked about you every birthday." His smile slowly faded. "Did she ever tell you why she left?" Emily thought for a moment. "She said she didn't leave." Alessandro frowned. "What do you mean?" "She said bad people made her run." His heartbeat quickened. "What bad people?" Emily reached into her backpack once again. "I almost forgot." She handed him a small silver key attached to a leather tag. "Mommy said to give you this when I found you." Attached to the key was a handwritten note. Safe deposit box 214. Trust no one except Marco. Alessandro immediately stood. Within the hour, he and Marco arrived at a private bank that had quietly remained under his family's protection for decades. Inside the vault, an elderly manager unlocked box 214 and stepped away. Only Alessandro and Marco remained. Inside sat a single envelope and a flash drive. Alessandro opened the letter first. It was written in Isabella's familiar handwriting. If you're reading this, it means Emily found you. I wanted to tell you the truth years ago, but I couldn't. The night I discovered I was pregnant, someone inside your organization overheard us. He believed a child would make you weak. He arranged my kidnapping before I could reach you. I escaped, but I knew they would keep hunting us if they learned where we were. So I disappeared. Not because I stopped loving you. Because I loved you both too much to risk your lives. If I survived long enough, I planned to return. If I didn't, please tell Emily every day that I loved her. And never trust Victor Romano. Alessandro stopped reading. His hands trembled. Marco's face turned pale. Victor? Victor Romano wasn't just another member of the organization. He was Alessandro's oldest advisor. A man who had served beside his father. A man Alessandro trusted like family. Marco quickly inserted the flash drive into a secure laptop. Security camera footage appeared on the screen. The recording was dated 7 years earlier. It showed Victor secretly meeting with members of a rival crime family. Money changed hands. Documents were exchanged. Then Victor's voice became clearly audible. Separate the woman from De Luca. And the child. If there is one, make sure he never finds out. The room fell deathly silent. Marco slowly closed the laptop. My God. Alessandro's expression hardened. Every trace of grief disappeared. Only controlled fury remained. He betrayed Isabella. He stole my daughter. He lied to me for 7 years. Marco looked toward him carefully. What are your orders? Before Alessandro could answer, his phone rang. One of his security commanders. Boss! What is it? There has been a breach. Alessandro's heart skipped. What happened? The east security gate was sabotaged. His blood ran cold. And Emily? The commander's voice shook. She was playing in the garden with 2 guards. Alessandro was already running toward the door. Speak! The guards are down. A gunshot echoed through the phone. Then came the words every father fears. They've taken Emily. The line went dead. Alessandro stopped in the middle of the hallway. For one terrifying second, the mansion became completely silent. Then the most feared Mafia boss in Europe looked at Marco with eyes colder than steel. They wanted a war. He reached for his pistol. They've got one. And somewhere beyond the walls of the estate, a frightened little girl clutched her stuffed rabbit as a black SUV disappeared into the forest, carrying her toward the men who had stolen her family once before. Alessandro De Luca stormed through the mansion like a man possessed. Every guard stepped aside. No one dared speak. The news echoed through every hallway. Emily had been kidnapped. Within minutes, the mansion transformed into a command center. Large digital maps lit up the security room. Surveillance footage streamed across multiple monitors while dozens of Alessandro's trusted men coordinated search teams across the city. Marco entered carrying a tablet. We found the escape vehicle. Alessandro looked up. Where? It was abandoned 20 miles from here. Any sign of Emily? Marco shook his head. But one of our drones picked up movement near an old shipping warehouse by the harbor. Alessandro's eyes narrowed. Victor. Marco nodded. He owns the property through a shell company. Alessandro loaded a fresh magazine into his pistol. This ends tonight. Rain poured over the abandoned harbor. Lightning flashed across the dark sky as more than 30 black SUVs surrounded the warehouse from every direction. Alessandro stepped out first. His bodyguard silently formed behind him. Marco checked his watch. Our snipers are in position. Thermal cameras. Confirmed. Emily. Marco pointed toward the second floor. Heat signature matches a small child. Alessandro closed his eyes for one brief second. She's alive. That was all he needed to hear. He raised one hand. Move. The warehouse doors exploded inward. Victor's guards opened fire immediately. Bullets ripped through wooden crates. Glass shattered. Smoke filled the building. Alessandro's men responded with disciplined precision, forcing the kidnappers backward without harming innocent hostages. Through the chaos, Alessandro heard a familiar, frightened voice. Daddy! His heart skipped. Emily! He sprinted toward the sound. Up the metal staircase. Down a narrow hallway. Then he saw her. Emily sat tied to a chair inside a small office. Tears streamed down her face. The moment she saw Alessandro, hope returned to her eyes. Daddy! Before he could reach her, a pistol clicked behind Emily's head. Victor Romano stepped from the shadows. His once friendly smile had disappeared. So, Victor laughed softly. You finally know the truth. Alessandro lowered his weapon slightly. Let her go. Victor shook his head. 7 years ago I warned Isabella that you would destroy everything you loved. You lied to me. I protected the organization. You murdered my future. Victor smiled coldly. A leader with a family becomes weak. Alessandro took one careful step forward. I'm only asking once. Victor pressed the pistol harder against Emily's head. Take another step and she dies. Emily looked at Alessandro. She wasn't crying anymore. She remembered the game he had taught her inside the SUV. Stay calm. Trust me. Alessandro noticed something Victor didn't. Emily's stuffed rabbit still rested in her lap. Slowly, almost invisibly, she loosened one of the ropes around her wrist. Just enough. Victor kept talking. I built your empire while you chased ghosts. You stole my daughter. I made you stronger. No. Alessandro's voice was calm. You made me forget who I was. Victor laughed. And now? Alessandro smiled for the first time. Now I'm her father. At that exact moment, Emily threw her stuffed rabbit directly at Victor's face. Instinctively, Victor flinched. 1 second. That was all Alessandro needed. He lunged forward. Victor fired. The bullet struck the ceiling. Alessandro slammed him against the wall, knocking the pistol from his hand. The two men crashed through a desk before Alessandro finally pinned Victor to the floor. Victor struggled desperately. You'll lose everything. Alessandro looked him directly in the eyes. I already lost 7 years. Police sirens echoed outside. Marco entered with officers from an international task force. Victor's criminal network had already been exposed using the evidence Isabella had hidden inside the safe deposit box. The officers handcuffed Victor. His empire was over. As they led him away, Victor looked back one final time. You'll regret choosing family over power. Alessandro never answered. He simply walked to Emily. She threw her arms around him. This time, he hugged her back with every ounce of strength he had. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry I wasn't there. Emily smiled through her tears. You came. He kissed the top of her head. And I'll never leave again. 6 months later, the atmosphere inside Raven International Airport felt completely different. There were no armed convoys. No frightened crowds. No flashing weapons. Only a father and his daughter. Alessandro had dismantled much of his criminal empire, turning over evidence that helped authorities dismantle several violent organizations. The legitimate businesses he owned continued to operate under new leadership, allowing him to step away from the life that had cost him so much. Emily held his hand tightly as they walked through the terminal. "Are we really going on vacation?" Alessandro smiled. "The first of many." She laughed. "Can we build sandcastles?" "We'll build the biggest one on the beach." "And ice cream?" "As much as you want." She grinned. "I think Mommy would be happy." Alessandro looked toward the bright morning sky beyond the airport windows. "So do I." Before boarding, Emily reached into her backpack. She carefully placed Isabella's silver heart-shaped pendant into Alessandro's hand. "You keep it now." He looked down at the necklace that had reunited them. "I'll treasure it forever." Together, father and daughter boarded the plane, not as strangers brought together by fate, but as a family finally given a second chance. As the aircraft lifted into the clouds, Alessandro silently made one final promise. No empire. No fortune. No power on earth would ever be more important than the little girl who had run into his arms at an airport and changed his life with a single word. Dad. Thank you for watching. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more emotional mafia stories filled with sacrifice, redemption, and unforgettable twists. See you in the next story.